To order. Acknowledge that the District of Tofino operates within the territory of the Tla-o-qui-aht First Nation. Notice to attendees that the meeting is being video recorded and will be published on the District of Tofino's YouTube channel. Notice to virtual attendees to sign up for public comment and question period using the Q&A function in Zoom. To register, participants are required to enter their full name, residential address, and the agenda item they wish to speak to. I'll move from the chair that pursuant to section 15 of the District of Tofino Meeting Procedure Bylaw number 1229/2016 as amended, the January 15th, 2023 Committee of the Whole meeting be held electronically via Zoom and live broadcast on the District of Tofino's YouTube channel, and that the facility provided for the public to watch and hear the meeting be located at Municipal Hall, 380 Campbell Street in Tofino, BC. Have a seconder? Second by Councillor Steer. All in favour? Seeing no objections, recommendation is passed. I move from the chair that the January 15th, 2024 Committee of the Whole agenda be adopted. Seconded by Councillor Steer. All those in favour? No objections. And then finally, move that the minutes of the Committee of the Whole meeting, November 20th, 2023, be adopted. Councillor Sloman, any objections? Seeing none, motion is carried. Do you have any public comment?
Thank you, Chair McMaster. Currently, we do have one member in the attending via Zoom, so I'll do a call for anyone that would like to make a comment to council. They can do so now by stating their full name, their address, and the agenda item they're speaking to. So I'll do a call 3 times, calling once, calling twice, calling 3 times, and no questions at this point, Chair McMaster.
Okay, moving on to 8.1, we have a report from the CAO on the paid parking revenue allocation.
Thank you. Good evening, Mayor and Council. I am returning back to Council after, actually, there's not, that's for the next agenda item. So no, that's okay. I don't have a formal presentation for tonight. I'm just going to briefly run through the report that was included in Council's agenda package. I'm returning to Council after a discussion that occurred at the June 5th, 2023 Committee of the Whole with respect to allocation of paid parking surplus funds. At that meeting, Council directed staff as follows: to allocate paid parking program surpluses on an annual basis. So these surplus allocations would return to Council to be confirmed during the financial planning process. A minimum of 25% to the recreation facilities, both indoor and outdoor, including debt servicing by introducing a recreation facilities reserve fund bylaw. So this report addresses that. A minimum of 15% to the existing roads infrastructure reserve fund, which is already in place, and a minimum of 10% to a paid parking reserve fund bylaw, which this report addressed as well. So staff today are going to discuss the specifics regarding the percentage allocations and the provisions restricting the use of funds in the bylaw. So those have been laid out in detail in this report to Council, and I'll just briefly go over those. So for the recreation facilities reserve fund that we would like to establish, the funds would be placed to the credit of the reserve fund at a minimum of 25% of the annual paid parking surplus, and funds acquired from surplus funds related to paid parking or any other surplus, voluntary contributions or funds otherwise provided for in the community charter can be credited to this reserve fund. So it won't restrict it just to paid parking reserve funds. Anytime we establish a reserve fund, it's a good idea to expand the different ways that the reserve fund can be credited in case we do receive a donation, as an example. So funds in this reserve fund will solely be used for the purposes of planning and development, capital expenditures, and debt servicing related to indoor and outdoor recreation facilities. And so that lays out the provisions and how those funds can be utilized that are in those reserve funds. So the second, or the So that concludes that reserve fund. The second reserve fund that we need to establish is the pay parking reserve fund. There was extensive discussion at the June 5th committee of the whole meeting, at which staff provided quite a lengthy list of the possible uses of funds for those. And some of them received more support than others. And so I've established a reserve, or proposing to establish a reserve fund based on the results of those discussions. So the funds would be placed to the credit of the reserve, a minimum of 10% of the annual pay parking program surplus, and similar language in the other reserve fund that I just talked about, funds acquired from surplus. So any surplus, voluntary contributions, or funds otherwise provided for in the community charter could be placed to the credit of the reserve fund as well. So at the June 5th committee of the whole, council expressed the importance of having a portion of the funds reserved for a variety of uses, and this would allow for current and future council priorities to be met or have flexibility in that. So the following uses were discussed and supported: recreation facilities, recreation equipment, roads and sidewalks and multi-use path infrastructure, parks facilities, transit, and parking infrastructure. Those that received less support from council were EV charging stations due to grants being available, seasonal shuttle and beach access due to RMI funds being available for those. So the reserve funds will restrict the use of funds to the agreed upon list by council, and can be amended if council is not satisfied with how the recommendation is worded. But for clarity, I will read the recommendation as it's stated in the report. That staff be authorized to introduce a recreation facilities reserve fund bylaw for planning and development, capital expenditures, and debt servicing related to indoor and outdoor recreation facilities. The second recommendation is that staff be authorized to introduce a pay parking reserve fund bylaw for capital expenditures related to recreation facilities, recreation equipment, roads, sidewalks, and bump infrastructure, parks facilities, transit, and parking infrastructure. If council is satisfied with this recommendation, we'll bring the reserve funds back to the January 23rd meeting to establish and introduce.
Thank you. Any questions for the CEO?
Go ahead. Through the chair. Now, I just want to get to, I noted the original discussions with council, the numbers for the recreation reserve fund were a bit higher, like 50%. I think Councillor McMaster originally said 75%. Now, I know that came down to minimums as opposed to general, but can you just re-explain that? My concern is that, you know, how will the remaining 65% be allocated, and how can council be reassured that, you know, if council chooses more into the say the recreation facility reserve fund, that will be something council will be able to do?
Sure, thank you for the question. So every year, staff will come forward once the surplus is established and finalized through the audit process, and we will seek a resolution of council to allocate the 100% of the surplus. So at minimum, we'll allocate based on council's resolution at the June 5th meeting, and that will be laid out in the reserve fund bylaw, and then we will ask council how they would like the balance to be allocated.
Super, thanks for that.
Anyone else? No question. Just it's about the use of the reserve funds, say for recreation facilities. If by chance the multiplex got built and we participated, could we use that recreation facilities fund towards our contribution to the multiplex to offset the cost that the taxpayer has to pay? Tofino taxpayer has to pay.
So the bylaws language will read recreation facilities indoor and outdoor. And so it doesn't restrict it to the district boundaries or anything like that. So that would be the purview of council on how those funds would be utilized. So the utilization of funds would occur in the same way as the CNI levies or any other reserve funds we have. We'd bring a project sheet forward to council, and we'd be seeking council's support to fund those out of that particular reserve fund if the provisions allowed for.
Okay, so it could lessen the cost to the Tofino taxpayer.
It could.
If we so decided.
Good.
Okay, that's all I needed to know.
Maybe just for clarity on that, because it is a service of the ACRD, the multiplex, and that's how would Tofino's contribution specifically to that lower our tax burden on there? I think the only thing we're really have established at this point is potentially an operating deficit, and we would contribute to that. How would that reduce our taxation?
So if I think that would be a conversation at that moment with council. I think it's unclear to staff at this time how those expenses will be managed. If there will be debt servicing, I think it's a project that hasn't come forward to council for funding just yet. So when it does, we will look to the various funding sources that could support that. I think what we need to be careful is we don't restrict the language too much so that we can include debt servicing, we can include facilities, but not restrict what type or where. And then that would allow this council and future councils the ability to be flexible depending on their priorities.
Yeah, so that potential operating deficit could be, if we so chose, could be allocated through those paid parking reserve fund.
It could be, yes.
Okay. Good, Councillor Anderson.
So just for further clarification on that, the way the language is here could be used for capital or debt servicing, but it wouldn't include operational costs. Because that would be the main burden on the Tofino taxpayer. Because my understanding is it's supported, but those multiplex society is expected to raise the capital costs separate from taxation.
If I may.
Mhm.
Oh, sorry.
Right, I guess there's a question in there somewhere.
Yes, no, I think no, that's a good distinction. And so I think if I probably need to think about this a little bit more, and I haven't fully crafted the language of the reserve fund. If council would like to have operating costs be an eligible expenditure related to recreation facilities, I should probably add that language in there. Currently, it would say planning and development, capital expenditures, and debt servicing related to indoor and outdoor recreation facilities. So correct, the language does not specifically reference operating, and that may be necessary for any facility that we operate or function. And that, my apologies if that was the desire of council in our previous discussion. I did not pick up on that language, so I'd have to amend that.
Yes.
I don't, just my recollection through the chair, I don't recall talking about operating costs as part of this reserve fund, but maybe that was really just because we were so focused on getting the local recreation center built and other recreation facilities, and I think that's generally the goal of council. So I don't think it was you missed it. I just think we didn't discuss it.
No, I think that's just come into the discussion today.
But I think it might be to do with the multiplex, and I just want to make sure that we're that's, I think our goal is the gym, the recreation facility in town. So anyway, and then just my opinion to council, non-opinion.
Maybe it's Councillor Sloan first and Councillor Sawyer.
Oh,
Councillor Thomas.
yeah. Through the chair, I think operating costs might be something not necessarily related to multiplex, but even if we build our own facilities, operating costs might be something we want to keep open down the road. Because say we build a gym or we build an outdoor pool, what do we do once these things are built? We'll have to still upkeep them and operate them.
I certainly don't see a problem with adding operating costs into the amendment.
I just have a comment. We're only, I mean, just to be clear, this recreation facility reserve fund is only 25% minimum.
Minimum.
So we've still got, even with the other reserve fund, we've still got 65% of our paid parking revenue, which in my mind, I just want to make sure that we're not diluting our goal, which was to get facility built. It's going to take a lot of money, and once we get one, maybe we need two, who knows, but we've still got 65% of this reserve that could be used for operating costs. That's my comment. So I just want to make sure that we're not diluting until we've lost the plot for the focus of this reserve fund, which is a facility.
I don't think
Capital
we're
cost.
diluting. I think we're just adding. It still ends up being a council decision.
Okay, just my opinion.
Councillor Sawyer.
I wanted to agree with Councillor Thomas. I think that far-reaching operating costs would be useful if we've gotten to a point where we have built something or have made arrangements with our existing facilities, and that would allow us to maintain pitches or buildings. So I'd agree with working in that wording.
Have a comment on that?
I have a suggestion for language. I don't know if I should go ahead.
No, I'll go ahead and then I have another question, comment.
Okay. If there's a concern around the language, operating language, we could have slightly more flexible language and include a provision to allow for to minimize property taxation related to recreation facilities. So that would include debt servicing, that would include where we may see a requisition increase substantially. That may include where we have a deficit in operating costs and can't cover it and don't want to increase property taxes in that year. So that language would add a bit more flexibility, but wouldn't be so specific to operating costs. Entirely specific.
Any comments?
Maybe, Mr. Chair, I think that the original intent was to build a capital fund so we would have something to solidify any grant applications and other things we did, so that we had a start on it. And generally, I don't think we reuse reserve funds for operating costs anywhere. So I'm not really, I mean, I guess it's worth discussing and that, but it might be better to leave that off the table too, because we do have another portion of parking funds, and it's that we're free to use however we want. We can put them more into any reserve funds, I believe. But including the new ones that we might be establishing. And I think we still have the discretionary power with any money that might come from parking to put them towards reducing taxation, possibly in any field. I mean, if we want to earmark it specifically for operating costs related to recreation, it's there. I guess the advantage is that the taxpayers can see exactly where parking funds are going, but it would be reducing taxation overall, no matter where we put it. So, the other thing is, I think when we get to the other side, so hopefully someday of having a recreation facility, we'll probably be rethinking these reserve funds anyways and the allocation of parking funds. So there would probably be at some point, some revision of of these numbers, how these reserves are used and how parking funds are used. Parking funds are relatively new to the district. I think the intent was two things, is get some capital together to put towards a recreation facility along with some other things, and to show the taxpayer where those parking funds were going. So I'm just trying to get us back to the original intent before we spend money that we don't have yet.
I just more or less, and the more I'm inclined to leave it as it is. I think we're going to be faced with a decision on recreation facility versus multiplex within the next year, pretty soon. So, is there any more comments, or someone want to move the recommendation?
Do you have more comment? Or
I just
have my hand up before.
Oh,
Yeah.
Move the recommendation.
no.
Through the chair, I do agree with Hal or Councillor Anderson. I am uncomfortable personally with changing this too much, and I'm uncomfortable changing the language to be about reducing taxes, because there's not a mention in this at all. This is to build a reserve fund. May reduce taxes, obviously, but that's my opinion. I am inclined to leave it as is, and maybe in talk about operating costs, maybe that's something that we can talk about with the rest of the revenue that we haven't made yet.
So I have a comment because it regards the other 65%. I'm comfortable with the recommendation as put here, but I do want to bring, since it is a committee of the whole, we've had issues in the past, for example, with council grants and not having we had a policy, but not really having a clear framework. And so there were times when we had some less than fruitful conversations about how we'll allocate council grants. And so leaving 65% roughly open to council's consideration without any, and maybe it's coming in a later report, but without having any sort of guidance or framework for us to be able to look at how we're going to go about that discussion. I have to say, I am concerned because we had some conversations in the past that just were very, very difficult because we really didn't have, we maybe had a bit of guidance, but we didn't utilize the guidance. So without any form of guidance, I can see this being a very difficult conversation without some guidelines around, for lack of a better description. Just thought I'd throw that out there. And I don't know if staff are looking towards any form, because my understanding right now is just open to council consideration for the remaining 65%. That'll be a long, difficult debate within council without any guidelines, I suspect. I'll just throw that out there.
I can respond to that. I think if we're bringing this discussion forward through the budget process, we may have areas of the budget that may require funds that we haven't fully funded. Certainly council does not need to allocate 100% of the surplus. It would just roll into general surplus. And then we can utilize those funds through general surplus, which is a much bigger discussion. What we are lacking, and it relates to some of the language in these bylaws, is the reserve fund policy, and that policy language would include minimum contributions. It would include minimum levels in each of the reserve funds. So in the absence of that policy, we're including language in the bylaws that doesn't necessarily be in there if we had a policy. When we bring forward the reserve fund policy and include guidance in there for council on how to allocate funds and what to be mindful of when allocating, we can go back to these reserve funds and amend them, not to entirely change the provisions or the intent and the use of the funds, but in terms of minimum contributions, we can revisit that at that time. But it is, council does not need to allocate any surpluses generated in any of the services that we have. They can roll into surplus, and I'll use building inspection as an example. In previous years, we've had, upwards of $70,000 in surplus in that service area when building permits have been significantly higher than in previous years, and we didn't require it to to fully fund the service in that year. So that would roll into surplus that year. And if there was a projected deficit in another year, we could draw from surplus like we have in other service areas, such as the daycare, as one example. So certainly not requiring council to allocate 100%, but that would come forward to council in a conversation the same way as the financial plan would, and those types of discussions would come forward. So there would be, I'm hearing that there needs to be some structure to it, and I'll certainly share that with the financial officer.
Yeah, I can imagine council, if they got 65% surplus that day. Yeah, I just throw it in general surplus. We don't want to have a discussion. I suspect they'll want to be able to allocate, but anyways, thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Anyone else? So I want to move the recommendation.
I'll move that staff be authorized to introduce a recreation facilities reserve fund bylaw for planning and development, capital expenditures and debt servicing related to indoor and outdoor recreation facilities. That staff be off. Oh, is that two separate ones?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So we'll. Thank you.
All those in favour? Seeing no objections, that motion is carried.
And that staff be authorized to introduce a pay parking reserve fund bylaw for capital expenditures related to recreation facilities, recreation equipment, roads, sidewalks, and multiple use path infrastructure, parks facilities, transit, parking infrastructure.
Seconded by Councillor Thomas. All those in favour? Seeing no objections, that motion is carried. Okay, moving on to 8.2, utility rate review, verbal report.
Hey, me again. I will be presenting on the utility rate review. And I'll be presenting with Mr. Kirkland, the manager of infrastructure and capital project. So I'll begin the presentation by going over the introduction to this process and the purpose of our review. And then Mr. Kirkland will provide a background and the external factors and the risks associated with this review. We'll go over the objectives when conducting a utility rate review and project-specific objectives that we're considering through the utility rate review. What the current rate equity is looking like, which we've seen before at the council table. So I'll bring those values back and have a look at 2023. And then we'll go over some forward-looking considerations and what the next steps will be in this process. So this may look familiar to council. This is something that some members of council saw back in 2021 when we were going through the initial stage 1 review of the utility rates. At that time, that stage we mainly considered the revenue requirements at the time. There were no changes to the rate class because there appeared to be equity within the classes, and the rate model wasn't being exposed to a significant amount of external factors or risks at the time. We did a review of current billing and consumption and what our expense requirements were. Stage 2 of this review, which is underway, is quite a bit more thorough. We're doing a review of the rate structure, including classes and seasonality in the rates, review of consumption levels and demand analysis. We're having a close look at revenue requirements and expenditures, service connection fees, any special charges that we may want to consider, including the fixed and the flat fees that are in place currently. And we will be redeveloping the sewer utility charges as the wastewater treatment plan is meant to go online in 2024. So the purpose of our review is to determine the true cost, or some of the things we need to be mindful of is to determine the true cost of the district's water and sewer service. Operations and maintenance is being considered at this time, not capital costs that are above the threshold for tangible capital assets. Those are being covered off by the capital and infrastructure levy, and provide rate scenarios and options for council consideration. We'll be reviewing the expenses and determining revenue requirements, and we'll do that through the financial planning process, and council will see a more or less final examination of the water and the sewer fund expenditures and budgets in the coming weeks. Determining the true cost of the service per class of the water and the sewer service will help us determine how we establish those rate classes. And so for now, I will pass it over to Simon to do the background.
All right, so some background information that staff are using as a basis as we go through this process. So summer 2022 being one piece of review. 2023 was a little bit of an outlier. We're not sure if that's going to be kind of a common statistic given all the variables that occurred this summer. So in 2022, staff found that supply transfer was about 14% higher than the previous 5 years. Various reasons that could attribute for that, such as, industries coming back online and processing at alternative times in the calendar year. Staff didn't find any notable of note issues with maintaining the current supply and level of service that we have with respect to our water distribution system primarily. And then 2022 stage 2 was actually the maximum conservation measure that was required. Analyzing some conservation stages versus and comparing it with drought. So historically, Tofino operates on a 4-stage water system, or conservation program, which everyone's aware of. Typically, the revenue decreases gradually as the stage severity increases, loss in consumption. The impact to the revenue is due to the lower consumption rates due to the stage restriction program. Supply/system, so things we're looking at, the renewals that are required due to the aging infrastructure that Tofino has. Asset management programs, further refining the way that staff maintain the infrastructure and manage the level of service requirements for each piece. And challenges going forward, so change in water usage during the restriction periods, managing the commercial and industrial usage during those restriction periods, so evaluating, where staff can go with implementing different management protocols. The mitigation of revenue impact during the water restriction periods. Staff obviously having a close eye on the implementation of the wastewater treatment plant and the impact of actual operational costs as processes optimized. So not just the water utility, obviously the sewer utility rates as well. So several external factors and risks to the development of this new utility model. So operational changes. So the immediate as the wastewater treatment plant's being commissioned, and then as it's operational, the actual usage. So as we're commissioning, kind of looking at different risks, there's a lot of tanks that need to get filled up to do hydrostatic testing on. So kind of doing that in advance of our next historically dry season. And then once the plant's online, managing through use of water meters where most of the water is being used, utilizing reclaimed water systems, so on and so forth. Leak detection and mitigation program, which staff have already implemented this year, and further refining those programs. Changes in legislation, which we're unsure of in terms of zoning changes, short-term rental restrictions. Water conservation measures, so essentially revision to the conservation programs, which could be forthcoming, and then typically higher conservation equals reduced revenue streams. Pass it back to Ms. Tiana. Oh no, I still have a couple more. And rebate programs, so of course lower usage again equals reduced revenue. So managing any rebate programs, so there's a forecast or understanding of what the cause and effect of implementing rebate programs could have on our revenues, and other external factors which could come up. A couple examples here. So aging infrastructure equates to more unplanned operational repairs to Tofino system. Increased requirement and utility staffing due to aging infrastructure. So the unknowns of in the future of what that correlation has on staffing quantities. Now I'll pass back to Ms. Tiana. Thank you.
Yeah, so having a look at that external factors, staff realize that we really need to balance our objectives through this review. While we are experiencing risk factors and a risk to revenues or cash flows, We know what our revenue requirements are, and we can balance those risks through the objectives that we establish for this project. So we do need to ensure that there's revenue sufficiency, and these objectives are not laid out in order of priority. They're all going to be considered as we move through this process. The prime objective here is to develop a rate structure that helps us achieve our revenue requirement. Revenue stability, we need to establish rate structures that do have a variable component, but we need to likely ensure that there's a fixed component as there is now, so that we have stability in that revenue and we're not seeing large swings or fluctuations from quarter to quarter or year to year. Resource conservation, we do need to promote water conservation because we just talked about how last year went. I think that a desirable goal and sending pricing signals out to the customer are very important, but we need to balance that with our other objectives. We need a rate structure that's easy to understand. It should be easy for customers to understand, for staff to interpret, so that we're able to articulate to the customer what the rate structure means, how it was developed, and how it actually functions. Equity and fairness is something we talked about quite a bit in developing the rates back in 2016, and it continues to be an objective through this rate review, developing a rate structure that does allocate expenditures fairly. When we're looking at risk or external factors, we then look at our rate classes and determine within those classes, are there classes that are experiencing more risk than other classes? And then we'll take a harder look at those and figure out a way to reduce the risk. And that may include parsing out the customers a little bit more, the rate classes. And when we dig into our two different rate classes throughout this process, we'll start to see that there's a wide range of consumption within some of those classes. So public acceptability and political acceptability, we need a rate structure that's acceptable and transparent to the community, as well to council, and it needs to make sense and be clear to staff as we bring it forward and propose rate scenarios to council. Ease of implementation is very important. We are limited in terms of how we may be able to establish the rate structure based on the administrative tools that we have available to us, but we do need to make sure when modifying the rate structure that it's something we can actually implement. And it's something that we can look at from year to year and review and bring recommendations for to council without revisiting or revamping the entire rate structure. So rate model standards are important to consider, but in reality, we need to pick a rate model that is relevant to our community, the consumption that we see, and the customers that we are serving. So some project-specific objectives are to establish a rate structure, as I just mentioned, that's easy to administer and review on a regular basis. It is our goal to review this rate structure annually. These are two very big utilities that we're overseeing, and by review, I mean we're doing that as a staffing level. Council may or may not see any amendments being brought forward, but we will certainly report out to council on how we're looking at that review and what it included and what considerations we did consider as part of that annual review. Likely that will come forward in our financial planning process every year. And we would look through the lens of natural asset management and climate resilience. We're certainly doing that now. This may play a larger role in future reviews as we gain more knowledge and understanding and expertise around our assets from a natural asset perspective, as well as an asset management perspective. We will be assessing the overall rate class structure. Currently, we have 3 classes. We have the residential class, the commercial and other class, and the fire flow class, which is attached mostly to that commercial and other class. And so I'll go through those in a moment and what they're looking at in terms of equity and consumption over the last couple of years. We'll be reviewing fixed and variable charges in the rate structure to meet some of those objectives that I went over a couple slides ago. We'll determine the applicability of seasonal rates. We'll review those service connection fees that are established when a new service is connected or increased. We'll look at the proportion of the sewer rate to the water rate. Currently, those two rates are tied together at 90%. The sewer rate is 90% of the water rate. We will need to look at a different model because our revenue requirement in the sewer fund will be higher than the water fund now. So we will review additional charges such as water turn on and off fee, whether there will be a multiple meter charge. We're looking at reality and on the ground with the infrastructure team. And we're realizing that there may be some areas that we may have one-off or very specific situations that we may want to have a fixed charge for. So we'll be bringing all of those discussions back to council for further more detailed explanation. So in 2022, this is a table that I presented in the last rate review, and something that I like to have a look at every time we're reviewing utility rates to ensure that there's equity within the rate model. And what I mean by that is that the in the second to last column, the total consumption of 455,000, how is that being consumed across the two classes? And I've lumped fire flow into commercial and other because it is attached to those accounts. What percentage of revenue are we collecting based on that percentage of consumption? So in the residential class, the total consumption is 31% of overall billed consumption, and we are collecting 32% of revenues. Similarly, in the commercial class, we're collecting a similar amount for the consumption level and revenue at 68% versus 69% of consumption. That's not the only objective we are looking at. As I mentioned earlier, and as Mr. Kirkland went over, there are risks hitting our rate model, and we saw a lot of those risks hit our rate model in 2023. So while the proportions of consumption and overall revenue remain the same in 2023, we experienced a decrease in overall consumption of 9.2%, related to conservation measures, related to low visitation, highway closure. A number of external factors and risks that we experienced in 2023 impacted our consumption, and then the revenue decreased 6.8%. So those two will never be equal, and that's because we've worked in some revenue stability into our model by having a fixed charge and a variable charge and stepped and seasonality rates within those. So all of those different types of charges, or the composition of the charge in those rate classes, are established to minimize our risk when we hit those situations that we felt strongly in 2023. So forward looking, there's always going to be different aspects of these utilities and the work we're doing on the ground that will play a role in our rate review on an annual basis. And that's why it's important to look at it on an annual basis and have a rate structure that's easy to administer and modify or amend if we need to. So we'll be revisiting our objectives annually, and some of those will be weighted heavily in some years and more lightly in other years. And I think that's the purpose and point of doing that every year. We have other commitments through annual rate reviews, which is continuing transparency and alignment with our service levels. As service levels may change in the community, or a requirement to install further infrastructure in certain areas, we may be looking at those utilities differently. So the service level impact and our asset management and renewal requirements will be incredibly important as we look forward and review our rate models. As council is aware and the community is aware, we have an asset management team that's in place and is looking at our assets on a daily basis, and new information is found daily. And that information helps feed into these rate review discussions. And so every year we'll become, I think, a little bit more savvy with that information, and we'll bring forward amendments to council that will be relevant to that work that we're doing on the asset management side. We will be having a look at and considering enforcement tools, and that will be looked at through our water conservation models and our staged approach. And that's something that we talked about in a previous report to council. And we're having a look at our leak detection process for leaks on private and public property. So the next steps in this process is to present the final water and sewer fund financial plans. We are getting close into refining those budgets, and after this week, we're going to have a very good understanding of where those financial plans sit over the next 5 years, with a good understanding of the operational requirements as it relates to the wastewater treatment plant. We would like council to keep in mind this is the first year that we will be commissioning the plant and operating the plant, and those operating expenditures we will need to learn after we operate the plant for a certain period of time. Then that's another reason why we need to review those rates on an annual basis. So we're likely looking at a rate review on the sewer side in 2024 as well as 2025 and likely into 2026 until we find the right place in those requirements from an operating side of things and a capital renewal perspective. So we'll develop rate scenarios. Likely we'll develop about 3 rate scenarios similar to the past, and we will present those to council for selection, and then we'll bring development or amendment bylaws forward based on the approved rate scenario. So we intend on getting this wrapped up before the end of March with the amendment bylaws adopted and new rates established for April 1st, 2024. So we are happy to answer any questions on that.
Questions? Mr. Steer?
I don't have a question. This is just a quick comment. I recognizing the scale and scope of this review is monumental, and I really want to thank staff for that, and especially this presentation where you're providing the objectives around that so that we clearly understand the direction that guides you. The inclusion of that transparency, I think, for the community and for council, critically important. So I thank you once again. And of course, you may have noticed we're going to have a huge new addition to our infrastructure that's going to be coming online this year. So we're entering new grounds, and it's going to take time for us to figure that out. So the main thing is I just wanted to thank staff for this is a huge exercise and recognize the complexities, and thank you for providing those the objectives and the pathway forward. So that's about it.
Thank you. Anyone else? Thank you.
Okay.
Yeah. Anyone signed up for question period?
Nobody has signed up. Chair McMaster, we do have one participant viewing online via Zoom, so I'll make a call. If anyone has any questions they would like to ask of council, they can raise their hand using the Q&A function in Zoom. You need to state your name, your address, and the agenda item you're speaking to. Call 3 times, call once, call twice, call 3 times, and no questions at this point.
Okay, we'll move into closed. I'll read the recommendation from the chair. That the meeting be closed to the public pursuant to sections 91 ACI of the Community Charter to discuss matters relating to A, personal information about an individual who holds or is being considered for a position as an officer, employee or agent. C, employee relations. I, receipt of advice that is subject to solicitor-client privilege, including communications necessary for that purpose. Seconded, Councillor Thomas. All those in favour? No objections. Recommendation carried. Does anyone need a break?